Thanks so much for carving out time to join me, Ali, and our guest, Charlie, today. It's wonderful to have all of you along with our partners and our guests. So thank you for joining us. Charlie, it is such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to this and fielding a bunch of questions.
So Charlie, as we kick things off, the folks on the line have seen your bio, but could you just talk to us a little bit about your background, bring us up to present day?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you the long version. If the not too long, don't worry. But if the bio is a short version, I'll give you the slightly longer version. I grew up in England. I don't hide that too well. And I actually was, when I was younger, I was a coder. Turns out I was a very bad coder, but that's sort of where my interest in the software space originally came from. I was coding when I was sort of 12 years old to 17 years old, just coding websites for local high street stores, gift stores, accounting shops, that sort of thing. Undergrad at Oxford, and then I decided that the US was a substantially better place to build a life and a career. So I moved over to here. I was at McKinsey & Company at the time, mostly working with tech companies. And I worked with a bunch of hardware manufacturers. Then went to Vodafone for a little bit and did M&A, which is where I first sort of got an interest in doing the investing side of what I do. So I was acquiring startups just like Hyperscience, which I'll speak about in a second, but sort of mid to late stage startups I was acquiring there for Vodafone to have as what we called value-added services then, but what nowadays we just call apps. So they wanted to offer apps on their phone, mapping services, if this then that sort of software. Did my graduate degree at Harvard. Met a ton of people in my network now that I still work with, which was where I really decided to stay in the US at that point. That was 10 years ago now. And then over the last, over that period of time, I've sort of been jumping in and out of what I refer to as growth investing, or others might call late stage venture investing, sort of Series C, Series D, Series E software companies. And then actually in companies themselves. So I invested in about 10 companies, growth stage company, well, exactly 10 companies, growth stage companies. Had the full spectrum of outcome. Some things that I'm immensely proud of, couple of IPOs that were north of $10 billion, and then some absolute disasters as well. So I don't know if that's going to come up, but I've had the full spectrum that I can sort of talk to. It's easy to smile about that now. It's much harder to smile about that in the past, in the moment. I went in to run one of my portfolio companies for a while, a video conferencing company actually called Fuse. Did that for 2 years in San Francisco. Then that was acquired by a company in Boston, which is where I moved for a little bit, a cloud-based PBX company, voice over IP. And I moved back to the East Coast at that point. And then I have been living in New York with my partner here in Manhattan, in Chelsea, for the last 4 or 5 years. A year and a half ago, I joined Hyperscience. I'm going to talk. I'm sure I'll talk a lot about that today. But joined as a chief operating officer. We are a very traditional Series C stage company. Enterprise software. Our average deal size is about $500,000. What we do, if you haven't heard of us, which if you have, it's remarkable, and we're doing some advertising pretty well, or maybe not, because the buyers are just very big enterprises. What we do is we help with document-based processes or paper-based processes. So things, we actually work a lot with the VA. We work with the Social Security Administration. We work with Housing and Urban Development. There's a few government agencies we work with. But we do things like processing mortgages, or processing disability claims, or processing insurance claims, or when you join a bank, Fidelity is one of our customers. Any of that paper-based process where you have to sort of prove who you are, or prove your income, or prove your place of work, or provide a whole load of data. We help process that data. It is very manual-based processes these right now, and we sort of try to automate them to end up in better outcomes for the end customer, for our customers' end customer. Been doing that for a year and a half. We're 165 people. I run the go-to-market side of the world, so everything but product and engineering, which tells you how bad of an engineer I once upon a time was. So sales, marketing, customer success, and finance and operations. Yeah, that's my overview, Bethany.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And one of the things that we talked about as we were preparing for this conversation was the fact that when you were looking for your next step, you looked at 50 different companies. You did a massive scan about to see what was out there, which I thought was so smart. And you said none of them came close to Hyperscience. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what made this company so compelling for you?
Yeah, so most of my time investing has been really analyzing the growth stage of a company. So the Series B to Series E. And a lot of that is on what I call go-to-market, sales, marketing, post-sales. So I took that, a lot of what I'd learned and applied it to myself, where I was my own SDR, my own account executive, my own VP of sales, where the product was effectively me, and the company that was buying it was any target company that I was looking at. I did it sort of in an incredibly thorough way, built a list of 200 companies that I wanted to meet, ended up meeting with 50 CEOs exactly, had a good sense of the kind of role I wanted. And when I did those meetings, as I think everyone on this call is probably aware, any interview is really very much a two-way process. And the process for me was to really work out whether it was a fit for me. There's a few things that I looked for as an investor, and then those things become amplified when you're actually not just making sort of 1/10 of your bets on it, but a full bet on it, your sort of personal career versus a sort of finance investment. And I really wanted to make sure I got it right. So I'll tell you the things that resonated with me and that really made me pick Hyperscience. And it's not just the really cool name. There was a lot more than just that. One of the key things, I'll sort of speak about three areas. The first is the sort of product in the market. Actually 4 areas. The second is the vision, which is always a very, very important thing. The third is really the people you choose to work with, which I think is immensely valuable. If you have the ability to choose the people you work with, it makes a giant, giant difference. And then the last thing is really the overlap between the company's needs and my skill set. And those were all the sort of things that I was looking for. So on the product and market side, there's a lot of investors that have made a ton of money investing in what they call $0 billion markets. One of the best investors in the world, Vinod Khosla, from Khosla Ventures in the West Coast, invests in $0 billion markets, goes out and invests in things that don't yet exist and creates them. That's definitely not my skill set, and I didn't have any massive appetite to do that. So one of my first criteria was looking for something that was real, a problem that was being faced right now, a market that existed. So these processes, they're very tangible processes. Every one of us on this call has been involved in one of these processes. I filed for a mortgage for this apartment 9 months ago, paper-based process. If ever you've done a dent in your car, paper-based process. If ever you've done a visa application, paper-based process. I'm giving you ones that are particularly miserable processes to give you a sense of the kind of pain associated with those processes. But there's a giant market. We estimate the market is anywhere, just for processing these things, right, is anywhere from a $60 billion market to a $300 billion market. And these processes, the more I learned about it, are incredibly manual. So whether it's emailing in documents, whether it's physically sending documents, the process for it typically is either printing them out or opening a letter physically taking that letter and putting it in some box that is a box to say this is an insurance claim, or this is an application for a premium, or the various different boxes you go in. Someone then scans that document, and often the processes are so bad that if you send it in as a PDF on a website or via an email, someone prints it and then rescans it. This is how bad these processes are. And then you have data keyers literally looking at two screens, one screen of an image and another screen of a database. So it was a real pain, a giant market that was suffering from a real pain, and that pain was tangibly experienced by really everyone in the US, everyone in developed markets. And that was a compelling thing. Also, the product worked. I don't know how many people on this call have ever found themselves in a scenario where you're selling something that is really vaporware or sort of an idea, but I had no appetite for that. So there was that. The next thing, which was really the key thing that pushed me over, I think, was the vision. And I'm sure we'll speak more about sort of my bets on the way the world will go. None of them are particularly original, but they are sort of relatively have strong views on them. But my thought is that a lot of the way that customers are served today, end customers, the likes of all of us on this call, on what are document-based processes, are pretty negative outcomes. If you think of filing for an insurance claim, if you're filing for an insurance claim, it probably, unless you're part of a very, very privileged part of the population, is a meaningful thing for you. Maybe it's the way you get to work, it's the car you get to work in, or it's the security of your house or something. And those processes can take anywhere from 3 weeks if it's really positive to months on end if it's negative. Like I said, we work with the VA. Processes there take over a year on average, from sort of one of their multiple various paper-based processes starting to actually settling in anything. And that's a pretty miserable outcome for people. So the vision that I sort of heard at that point, or my way of articulating it, was very much, we do the beginning areas of those processes, but we want to do the end-to-end processes, just the back office, not the front office. But if you imagine AIG is a customer of ours and we do insurance claims, our aim is very much to have AIG advertising to their customers something along the lines of, in 5 or 10 years, right, we're not there. We have a very real product and we're going to a bigger product. But the vision there is very much to have AIG advertising to their customers something along the lines of 82% of insurance claims paid out in 7 minutes. Or something like that, right? That's just made up numbers entirely. But something that's wildly unachievable today with manual processes, that if automation can really deliver on what it promises, if machine learning can really deliver on what it says it can, would be a radically beneficial outcome for AIG's end customers. And you can imagine that same thing for a bunch of different industries. So that vision was a very important thing for me. I think automation is an area which we as a society have to navigate really carefully. And I think that this is an instance where there is clear benefit to society if we get this one right. The next area, and I'll sort of speed up because I'm sure there's a bunch of questions, but I think integrity of the people you work with is something that I really look for. I've worked with some wildly successful companies and some wildly unsuccessful companies, and the consistent thing that I've enjoyed working with is good people. I mean, good-natured people that when the good times come or the bad times come, you're working with people that when you leave the room, you can trust, and you know they're going to make the right decision. You know they're looking out for each other, and they're looking out for you, and they're looking out for the sort of good of the rest of the company. And I've definitely worked in scenarios, I hope I don't have to talk about them today, but where that isn't true and it's miserable. So that was a key thing for me. And I wanted to meet a bunch of the leadership team, the board, and check that we were all on the same page on how we would approach certain situations. And I think in today's climate, that is ever more important. It's always important, but it feels particularly important right now. And then I had a fourth area, didn't I? I'm trying to remember what my fourth criteria
Oh,
was.
Charlie, it was the intersection between the needs of the
Yes,
company and your skill set.
exactly, which is also an important one. Thank you, Bethany. The area that the company was most nascent on was the go-to-market side, which is what I wanted to look at. So all of the sales at that point, when I joined, we were $5 million in revenue. All of the sales at that point were what I would describe as leadership-led. Great product referred into a customer by an investor, and then a strong leadership team went and closed that deal. And what we focused on, which I believe is sort of an area that I very much enjoy, is building out a much more scalable, repeatable series of processes. So it was really that combination of product, vision, quality people, and what I thought that I could bring to the table. That I literally had a spreadsheet ranking everything. And after I got out my first meeting with Hyperscience, it was very clear to me that the spreadsheet was going to break with how great this one was.
That's so helpful, Charlie, to get your framework for how you evaluated this opportunity. And folks, we're starting to get questions coming in over Slido and Slack. Please use Slido for those. And I want to pass one on now from Chris Perry, Charlie, because it dovetails with this conversation. And he's saying, what are some of the less obvious metrics or KPIs that you use to assess Hyperscience? So that like the overarching framework is really helpful. What was the data? What sort of quantitative measures were you looking? You talked about size of the market. You talked about revenue. What else were you looking at?
Yeah, so I'll speak about a little bit about this one in terms of how I look at investment as well. But with Hyperscience, I was referred by an investor. I knew the Gartner analyst that had written about Hyperscience, and I was actually a good friend of mine on the West Coast, Rafi, didn't invest. So he looked at the opportunity and didn't invest. So I felt like between that, my meeting with the leadership team, that I was really able to understand the sort of things that were in great shape in the more nascent areas, which, as I said, was the go-to-market side. I was able to understand that very much. Look, I think there's a few things that you can look at that really give you a signal of whether a company is doing well in the sort of Series B, Series C stage, which is where we were when I joined. We're now sort of Series C, raising Series D stage. But I think one of the first things, key metrics, is churn. Does a customer actually stay? And I think churn at a Series A stage company is you can get away with it. By the time you really become a Series B or Series C stage company, you're expected to know what you're doing. And Hyperscience didn't have many customers when I joined. We had very large customers, but our average deal size is $500,000 to give you a sense. But none of them had churned, and they'd been there for a while. And the consistent thing I heard was that they used the product, they loved the product, it worked extremely well. That's really the best gauge of product you can get, is churn. I think the next thing that I looked for was gross margin. And why gross margin? Gross margin to me, which I won't tell you the number, well, in fact, there's no problem telling you, it's in the sort of high 80s, 86%, 87% gross margin. The reason that gross margin is interesting is really twofold. The first is it gives you a signal of whether you're joining what I would refer to as a product company or a services company. And you should consider them both extremely differently. If it's a product company, the idea is you have a code base, you put it out there, and that is somewhat repeatable. I can go and sell that same code base to multiple people. That would be a high gross margin business. That's a good signal that is a product-based business. Will most likely have a much better shot at becoming a huge company. And then you have services-based businesses, which we'll sort of see in the gross margin that have much lower gross margins. And the reason for that is you're developing a lot of custom code each time. That would have signaled to me at the time that the company wasn't in a scalable position. And then the other thing that gross margin really signals is just the attractiveness of the business in the long run, right? As an investor, you invest in wildly loss-making businesses. Today, we're still loss-making at Hyperscience. We make our business out of losing money every day. but you do it because you believe that if you get enough scale, enough customers over time, that it will pay off massively. And you sort of, there's no better company that shows that than a Salesforce. For a long time, even when Salesforce was public, it was losing a ton of money. But that's because it was investing massively in two things, product development and growth. And growth, you pay for at the beginning and you get at the end, right? Which brings me to my next one, which is a next KPI is customer acquisition cost, or CAC. Customer acquisition cost is the amount you pay in dollars to get a dollar of revenue back. In the sort of Series C stage market, the best benchmark is a 1-to-1 ratio. I spend $1 to get $1. To give you a sense, that costs us about $500,000, and we're right on benchmark, by the way. So I say our average deal is $500,000. Our average land initial sell is is $300,000, but we pay about $300,000 to get that deal. So the first year is just totally loss making. So actually, the faster we grow, the more money we lose, because you'll always grow faster than your base. Well, hopefully. So whilst you're in that growth mode, you're losing more and more money if you've got a ratio which is 1-to-1 or even worse. If it was 2-to-1, it would signal to me that it was too difficult to sell this product. It was just too much of a lift to sell it. If it's less than 1-to-1, fantastic, but we were right on average and we've managed to keep that. But that's a key KPI. How hard is it to sell and how much money will you make over time? The inverse of churn, which you look for from a KPI, is customer lifetime. When churn is 0, that's a number you can't calculate, unfortunately. But you make some form of bet of how long you think customers will stick around for. And we find our software, which was true sort of when I was doing the diligence, very sticky. And that's a KPI that is a key thing. Like, how long do you think customers will actually be using it? And then obviously the last thing that I would say is a key KPI is usage. And usage is really, you'll see, and anytime you see usage, you'll always, the easiest way to show data on usage is the upward facing chart of usage over time. But actually the more interesting chart is either at a customer level, so whether customers themselves are growing, or you're just adding more customers. So is a specific cohort of customers using the product more, or are you just adding more customers? If a cohort of customers is using the product more, that's more interesting. And then the other area is just, number of customers you're growing. So there are a few KPIs that I look at as both when I was doing investing and when I was trying to analyze a potential company to join.
Super helpful, Charlie. And we're getting a bunch of questions that have to do with some of your recent comments. So I want to go through a couple of those. James Hendren is asking, what are key mistakes that you've seen young companies make when trying to raise capital? Maybe both from your perspective as a former investor and also now as an operator.
Yeah, key mistakes when trying to raise capital. That's a very good question. I think two come to mind. The first is around story, and the second around who you target. So, in fact, I'll start with the second, of who you target. I think the key thing is, it's just like, and I always relate a lot back to sales, but it's just like selling a product. You want to make sure there's good overlap between the product you're selling and the buyer you're reaching out to. And that is incredibly important in investing. And I see a ton of mistakes. People just want to go straight to Sequoia, or they want an introduction to this person. And you reach out to someone on LinkedIn and say, can you give me an introduction to this famous investor? And you really haven't thought that through. They don't know fintech, or they're not a Series A stage investor. So I think what I would refer to as product market fit between your company and the investor base is a really important thing. And that requires a lot of research. We raised our Series C, and that is in automation software, right? You think that is the biggest market you could possibly go out to in terms of overlap with venture investors. We aren't a Series A stage company. We sort of know who we are, and it's one of the biggest areas of investment right now in VC. But even we really targeted people. We didn't look at if someone had invested in a competitor. We didn't speak to them, not just because of competitive fears, but we thought we'd be wasting our time. And the second you start to get, I hate to say it, but the VC community is very much a tight-knit community. And the second you get one no, that spreads very, very quickly. So if you go to someone, I'm not going to sort of say who we didn't go to, but if you go to someone that you're pretty sure is going to say no to you, that is going to set things off really badly. You're going to feel less confident, you're going to look less confident, and the market's going to get a very bad signal. So actually being cautious with those calls and taking, even if someone reaches out to you, being willing to turn some down that you know is just going to end up, is 95% chance just not going to end up right. I think that fit really matters. And then the second thing is, I think that story really matters. And there's two sides to this, and I think people get it wrong all the time on both sides. The first is you're a startup, or sort of if you're doing this, you're a startup. And the role of a startup is to sell a vision. And if you get enough people to buy into that vision, and that vision can adapt over time, but if you get enough people to buy into that vision, you make a real company. The people you need to buy in are not just investors, they're customers, they're employees, but you have to rally people around a story. And so you have to be willing to sort of suspend that that distance or that delta between what you actually do and what you're going to do, right? So you heard me earlier speak about that story of like, we do something very mundane right now and we have a giant vision. And you have to have both sides of that. And the further or the earlier on you are in the fundraising landscape, the bigger that delta is. When you're a Series A company, don't speak about targeting a $1 billion market because that's what you think you're going to be able to build in the next year. No one's going to be interested by that. They want to know, like, this is a tangible route to this, and then that is a tangible route to that. And that flow and that story is a good thing. And then the second side of story is, why can you do that? How do you position yourself? So what I didn't tell you earlier is our story of why we think we can go from document-based processes to doing end-to-end processes. But when we go out fundraising, that is a key part of it. Why do we have the credibility to do that? And that's where you talk about a lot of the KPIs that we came up with earlier: no churn, customers believing us. We also talk about the idea, we don't talk about this with customers, but we do with investors, the idea of data, owning the flow of data into an organization being somewhat of a Trojan horse to give us right to do the steps further down the line. So I think those are the things that I would say people miss out on. They don't find the right, they're not looking for the right investors. They're just looking to take on any money. They're not willing to make that jump of what is the giant vision we're trying to do here, and they're too focused in the short term. And then they're not able to tell that story of how is that big vision actually real? I mean, the amount of times as an investor I would go and just hear these stories, I'm like, sounds great, but there's just no way I can believe you're actually going to deliver on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Charlie. That was really interesting. And we have a couple of questions from Ron and Raphael that are pretty similar. They're asking, you described this process of meeting with executives and sort of kicking the tires on integrity and culture as those conversations unfolded. They were asking a little bit more about what you were looking for and how you were eliciting those responses, and then ideas for how to do that when you don't have access to the CEO or the senior leadership team, and you're looking at the broader company or an earlier, an entry-level role or a mid-stage level role, and trying to assess fit for yourself and your own value system.
Absolutely. So look, this is a question that gets not just to being an interviewee, but being the person interviewing. And I do it a ton all the time, because not only did I not want to work with people without that integrity, I also don't want to recruit people to the company in that way. I think the best way is for very specific examples to very specific roles or whoever you're talking to, right? Tailor it exactly to who you're talking to. Think of super real scenarios that could play out and ask a question related to that. So I hire salespeople all the time. I mean, I interview probably 3 salespeople a week on average. A question or 2 questions that I always ask them, and this will just give you an example, I can give more if needed, but of how you tailor a very specific question to a very specific type of person answering that question. 2 questions that I would ask them, and I'll tell you the sort of the way the answers go to give you a sense of what I'm looking for. But the first question is, tell me a deal that should have got done at your last company that didn't get done. It doesn't have to be your deal. It's a deal that you saw somewhere in the company. And what I'm really looking for there is an understanding of why deals do get done and don't get done. So if someone gives an answer of, oh, this person in product just wouldn't give on this one issue and they just wouldn't commit to doing something, right? I know that, okay, they were trying to sell a product in that scenario where the product didn't actually fit what the customer was trying to buy, and there was a disjoint, and they were just trying to force something through. But I ask you, it's a harmless question of a deal that didn't get done. No one's got any concern with that question whatsoever. They've got 10 examples of it, but the way they answer it and what they tell me there tells me how they deal in those scenarios. And then I say, there's another question. I do the exact opposite of that, which is tell me a deal that did get done that shouldn't get done. And there I really want, and I guarantee you, any salesperson that I'm interviewing has seen deals get done that shouldn't have got done. And if they can't give me an answer, that tells me a lot about their integrity. And if their answer is an answer that is like, that does critically assess even one of their deals, I'll take it if it's one of their deals, but critically assesses why something got done that maybe wasn't in the interest of other parts of the company or the company as a whole, but is able to critically weigh up and say, look, we weighed it up and we knew that this was a bit of a risk, but I talked about it with this person, and you can see that even if someone's done something that might not be right, there's actually a lot of nuance in the way they answer that question. You can detect a degree of integrity. You obviously can't just ask the question, do you have integrity? The best way to answer, I've always found, is ask for, put people in real situations and say, ask for real things. If you're looking for a diversity question, tell me about the last leader you hired, and who were the 3 people in the front running, and how did you assess those 3 people? Stuff like that. You really understand how people make decisions in the good times and the bad times.
Charlie, we've talked about automation and the future of automation already today, but Pat Ross has a question about your applicant tracking system. And he says you still review applicants manually. Would you share why? What elements of a potential hire can automation not see?
This is a good question. I feel like I'm about to be sold automation software for applicant processing. Look, I think my view is everything can be automated over time, but I think it gets to a question which I'm not sure is sort of, well, Pat was the name of the person that asked this question, was it?
Yes, Pat Ross.
I'm not sure, Pat, whether the question was sort of one thing that we contemplate as a company a lot, which is biases. Biases of people sort of reading resumes, viewing LinkedIn. We've seen a ton of data that shows that just pictures or names massively influence the likelihood of a resume getting to the next stage. I think this is, unfortunately, in software, biases exist as much as they do in people. We consider it all the time with our software, and we have to actively write out biases. Unfortunately, if the biases exist on the human side, they're probably trained into the data set that trains the software. So I don't know that automation gets rid of biases, unfortunately. But I do think that if you can think those nuances through, either from a software perspective or a manual process, that is the first step for sort of creating a bias-free process, which you'll never create a totally bias-free process. It should always be an objective. But yeah, broadly speaking, I think that if you sort of consider automation massively speeding things up, if you could go from a world where it took 3 months for us to hire a role on average, and I'm guessing the same is the opposite, it took me 3 months to find my role. If you could speed that up and that was a month, that would have a massively beneficial impact on the company and people. So it's yet another example of how I think automation can have a massively beneficial impact on society, but it's not free of its own issues.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answered the question, Pat.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful, Charlie. Thank you. And I actually want to double down. I want to double down on automation, and I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit more about it. You wrote a blog in June, and I encourage the folks on the line to read that, regarding how you believe that office work will go through a similar transformation as we've seen with manufacturing and agriculture. You've talked a little bit about it, but I'd love for you to share more about this central role that you believe automation will play in the not too distant future.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because it has, and you can't answer the question without speaking about the sort of what I consider the somewhat obvious pros, but what inevitably is a somewhat obvious concerns or issues with automation. The first thing is, as we look backwards, I think backwards in time, I think we've seen that companies that embrace automation, countries that embrace automation, industries that embrace automation ultimately end up in substantially better spots, right? Japan is a great example of this. The agriculture industry is a great example of this. Outcomes for companies, sorry, let's start with industry. The outcome for the customers of industries that embrace automation are substantially better, right? We can say a lot of things about the food processing industry in America, a lot of bad things, but everyone in America can mostly eat affordable, healthy food. That is an exaggerated statement, but I think you see my intention with that statement. The same with manufacturing. Most people can affordably put clothes on their back in warm weather and cold weather. Just massively beneficial outcomes that weren't true before automation existed. The companies that embraced it hired more people. We've seen that, and were more successful. Countries that have embraced it, you look at the likes of Singapore as another example that have embraced technology and automation, or even America, have benefited from it. So I think when you look backwards, the benefits for all stakeholders in the process have been largely beneficial. Now, of course, there's massive negative externalities. We've got climate change. We've got maybe food that isn't healthy, processed food. There is those, right? And I don't want to shy away from those. What I don't think we've seen massively historically, and I think my prediction for the future would be the same, is massive challenges on the job front, which I think a ton of people are worried about. Some of the best, finest economists across time have written forecasts that by today, we would be working 1 day a week, and there'd be not enough work for everyone. We work more every year than we worked the year before. And what the inevitable thing is that change is substantially slower than you think it's going to be. So one thing that I think is a giant concern right now, or should be for the US government, is automation, automated driving, or driverless vehicles. Trucking is, I think there are 3 million truckers in the US. I think it's one of the largest professions there are. What will not happen when driverless vehicles come is that one day there is manually driven vehicles, and then the next day 100% of stuff is driven by a truck. What will happen is a portion of the route that is on a dead straight route, will be driven by a driverless and by a piece of software, and then the rest will be driven by hardware, or one company will pick it up, or one state will pick it up. And what you'll actually see is that, which I think has happened historically, just small changes happening, where sure, some portion of the population falls out of the workforce because they naturally were going to. Some portion is young and can sort of re-skill, does reskill. But the vast majority of change happens so slow that those changes can happen at a natural rate. And then when it comes to sort of office work, my view is very much that the benefit to society will be so great that to some degree, we don't have the right to be doing it, right? No one has the right to be, other than for organic farming and its benefits, the right to be picking tomatoes if a machine can do it. The benefits for society are just so enormous if a machine does it versus if a person does it, that there's some degree of, you have to balance that. And I think any paper-based process, right? We do disability claims for the Social Security Administration. If that takes a year to do that versus taking minutes to do it in the sort of end state of automation, I think that is a sort of wildly beneficial endeavor to go on. But I don't worry too much, and maybe it's short-sighted, but about the sort of displacement of jobs, because everyone that we've seen, we go in and we massively reduce the time it takes to do processes, but we've not seen a single person in any of our customers actually displace labor. We've had people hire slower, we've had people move jobs, but not a single company where that happens. Mm-hmm. So I think automation has a ton of concerns to be thought of, but a ton of benefit for society over time.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And when you were talking about it earlier, you said, you know, we need to be really thoughtful about automation, and clearly with your passion around hyperscience and the product that you all are building and bringing to market, you think that this is a positive application of it. Where do you think we need to be careful with regard to automation?
Yeah, I think we need to be careful across the board. I sort of said earlier that there were two broad predictions that I had. One is on the automation space, and I'll answer that question directly. But the other, just as an analogy, is that is really around the virtual reality space. My thought is that meetings like this at some point in the future will be extremely immersive. Where we can all be in our own homes, but we will experience a meeting that feels very real and very in person and more immersive than just a video call. I think when you think of that, you can think of all the dystopian ways that could play out very quickly. I'm sure there's a ton of sci-fi movies that have been written about that thought. So I think whenever it comes to this, we have to be incredibly careful, and unfortunately it falls on one group, which is government, unless everyone acts sort of somewhat in a good fashion together. It requires governments to write regulations that actually makes the bad outcomes less likely to happen, right? So there's a ton of bad outcomes in the software space you could imagine. I'll give you three examples, but the first example is, I'm not sure if everyone remembers the Capital One data breach that happened about 2 years ago. That is the kind of data that Hyperscience processes every day long, all day long, sorry. People's social security numbers, people's bank account numbers, people's names and addresses. The second you start having software processing these, you put them in places and locations and processes that are inherently exposed to attacks. Those can be attacks from other countries. They can be attacks from bad actors within your country, but it's a giant risk. And I think we've seen that in many different places. The second is really what I spoke to with Pat's question a little bit earlier, which is you can train software to do something, but it will do what you train it to do. And that can sometimes have very negative outcomes without you truly realizing. The biases is the exact example I gave earlier. That's a very clear one, right? If we ever did my vision with AIG, where you sort of pay out insurance claims, if the first 10 insurance claims that you pay out are white males, the machine has learned something, right? Unintentionally, you've taught it something. So you have to be very careful when you're programming software that, especially at the point we are right now in software development, that what you program is what you get. And the data you show it is what you get. And then the other area is really around labor displacement. Like, what are we doing as a government, as a country, as a sort of a group of, as a society, to educate people, to do skills transfers. Bill Gates spoke about this idea of taxing robots to make the playing field more equal between a sort of person wanting a job and a piece of software doing a job, and in terms of government receipts or tax revenue. There's a whole load of just nuances you need to consider as that landscape changes, that if we don't get ahead of, we'll have some pretty negative outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charlie. James is asking, he wanted to double down a little bit on security, which you started to talk about. And he says, have you incorporated blockchain technology to protect your long-term data?
So at the moment, our data for the sort of Capital One example that I gave sits on premise. Feels like a very backwards approach to things, but most of our customers prefer that it sits on their premises behind their firewall. None of them are using blockchain technology at the moment, but I'm sure a ton of them are starting to consider it. I don't know too much about the blockchain industry, unfortunately, to answer a very, in any way, sort of sophisticated answer there. But security is on our mind all the time, for sure. We have 5% of our company is dedicated to security, and we have on-premise software, right? So that is a layer of security that the customer takes care of on top of what we do.
Super, thank you, Charlie. Totally different question for you from Chris. He's saying, as a younger C-suite executive, how have you managed any potential age bias? Have you felt that at all? Have you confronted it? If so, how did you navigate it?
Yeah, I think that's it's a very good question. Firstly, we look for biases across the board, and like I say, we never do a good enough job of that, right? So I don't want to pat ourselves on the back or myself on the back to say that we do a good job of that, but we try to. I think that when it gets to age biases, my belief always is that the phrase is that, I hate the phrase, but I can't think of a better phrase: A players hire A players and B players hire C players. If you look at a bunch of the folks reporting into me, our head of sales, he famously says this is his 106th quarter. He's done it at 10 companies. Okta was one of them. He's gone in, set a company up from a very small sales team and grown it to a very big sales team. Truly exceptional. There's no way that I could do his job better than him. And that's the sort of philosophy I take to hiring, which is I try to hire people that can do their job better than I could possibly do their job. And that makes me look really good, right? When I go to the board and I deliver on sales because there's somebody that really knows what they're doing, I look good. Maybe one day he takes my job, but if I didn't hire him, somebody else would have hired him, and I would have hired someone that wasn't as good, and I lose my job anyway. So it's something that I actually try not to think about. I try to hire the best person for the role. And I realize that is a massively loaded statement, but I try to hire the best person that we can find. And I try to do the best job I can do. And I don't believe those two are sort of in conflict, despite the fact that I am a young C-suite.
I think that Chris's question was actually more about your own experience, and if you received or felt any pushback in terms of you being a C-suite executive, given how young you are.
Look, I think I was fortunate. The first C-suite opportunity I was given, I was very lucky to have been given. And it's a strategy which I unfortunately can't recommend anyone repeats, but I made an investment and it was a bad investment. And I was told to go in and fix that investment. So I invested in a company. It was a video conferencing company, actually. We competed with Zoom. This is sort of one of my moments I look back of as one of the toughest moments in my career. But I looked at Zoom, I looked at Fuse, and I looked at Blue Jeans. And they were all at around $7 million in revenue. All very similar. This was in 2013. And I picked Fuse. If I'd picked Zoom, I'd be in a very different apartment to the one that I'm in right now. But I picked Fuse. And after my investment there, which was as an investor, I'd been on boards, I had sourced deals, I had negotiated deals, but I'd never done everything end to end. And this was my first deal that I sourced, was on the board of, negotiated the price of, felt really good about. And then about 3 months in, it became very clear that it was a very, very bad investment. Not the worst of my 10, but probably the second worst. The worst we just let go of. But this one was sort of good enough where we were like, we believe in the space. I told you about my thesis of sort of immersive video conferencing. So I really, really believed in the space, and I was looking for a company in the space. 9 months after the investment, the revenue had gone from 7 million down to 4 million. And it wasn't so much was told, it was sort of a discussion, but I believed that I could try and turn it around. So I went in initially, nobody would have hired me for that role at that point. But I went in initially to stabilize the ship, and my technical title was president there. I went in as an interim CEO effectively. And what I realized sort of 3 months in, and it started very difficult. My first day was laying off 40% of the workforce because we were just not a viable business, wildly difficult. And I had to stand up in front of the remainders and said, I've had to let go of a bunch of your friends, but this is the only path forward, and believe in me. And I'm 28 years old, or whatever I was at the time. And I gave a sincere pitch of what I believe was a credible story of how we'd get through it. And over the next 3 months, things went extremely well. And the team really bought into that. Some didn't, some left over. We had, I think we went down to 120 people, and 20 people left over that next 3 months. That was another painful, but the rest of the 100 people really rallied around it, and we hired where people had been let go. I think it's hard to take a lesson from that, but the only lesson is, I think if you're ever exposed to, well, I think 2 lessons. If there are good things that can come out of bad things, if you're prepared to make bets where you think they're right to make them, I think a lot of positive things can come out of that. And then the other thing is, if you get a shot to really try something that might be outside of your comfort zone, you should do it. There's a ton of data that shows that when given promotion opportunities, men are substantially more likely to take them than women. This is data coming out of Oxford. And I think that is a sort of key thing for us to sit and reflect on, that sometimes you've just got to take that opportunity. And the more that we can teach that, the better, I think.
For those of you who were with us when we interviewed Alex and Margaret, that was an example of what Charlie just mentioned, where Margaret actually tried to get Alex to come in to Outcast multiple times as CEO, and Alex turned her down. She didn't mention it last week, but she has often said that she turned her down out of imposter syndrome at first. She was scared she couldn't do the job.
Yes.
Meanwhile, she's been doing it for years now very effectively. Charlie, I want to pivot the conversation again. I think we have time for about one more question. And I'd love for you to talk to us about tech in New York City. This is increasing its footprint. We would love to see more activity there. We have a lot of BreakLiners interested in tech who also want to be in the city. What opportunity do you see for tech in New York?
Yeah, look, I think tech in New York has been sort of a possibility and a bad joke all in one for the last 15 years. I think that the way it's the same with London, actually. When I was at McKinsey, we were doing a study on how to launch the London market for startups. I think that these environments really come out of what I would refer to as an ecosystem. And you have to look at what's present in the ecosystem to know, or to be able to guess what might come out of it, what companies might flourish in that. So Silicon Valley is obvious. It has every single thing it has investors, it has successful mentors, it has potential customers. You look at a Silicon Valley Series A, Series B enterprise software company, probably 50% of their revenue is coming from other Silicon Valley software companies who are willing to try their software. I think when you look at that, New York has a series of advantages that I think you'll see play out over time. The first is just the customer base. We find as a company that has lent towards financial services and insurance that we can just pop over, not now, unfortunately, but pop over to AIG and see them, or go over and see Amex, or when we're doing those sales, it's just substantially easier. And the knowledge base here, the mentorship here is substantially better. So I think the industries that have a lot of that part of the ecosystem, customers, mentorship in Manhattan, will be the areas that really flourish, right? So you see prop tech developing, fintech developing, and areas where sort of there aren't strong industries in Manhattan, I think you'll see develop substantially less. I think ultimately what you see is a lot of what you don't have from an ecosystem is a cheap sort of software development labor market, right? So there's very little advantage in Manhattan from a software development cost versus Silicon Valley. There is, it's about a sort of 90% versus 100% cost basis. But what you often see with New York-based companies is they'll have a headquarter where you have leadership and product, and so the product team, not the engineering team, marketing, sales, customer success sitting in Manhattan, but you have actual development sitting elsewhere. So we do Bulgaria for that example. So we try to get all of the benefits of New York and acknowledge what the benefits are without having the massive drag, which is wildly expensive engineering costs. We still have 20% of our engineering costs in Manhattan, 10% of people in Manhattan. But I think that the industries you'll see play out are ones that are prop tech, financial services, insurance. And one of the key things that needs to have happened, which I think you're starting to see more and more, is you have to have had successful companies exited in the region. And that just takes a period of time to play out. Those people become angel investors, they become mentors, they become success stories that people believe that it's actually possible. It's sort of all the predictions that I've made that New York is going to be a tech hub, the #1 tech hub. It's going to come true one day, but it hasn't yet. But I think it's coming a sort of long way forward. And you see the same in Boston, where it's a lot around healthcare and pharma. But I think it's about looking where the ecosystem is. A friend of mine just started I don't know why, but an energy startup, and they've done it in Austin because the ecosystem is there. So I think that's sort of the way to think about how the landscape will emerge over time.
Charlie, it was such a treat to interview you over the last hour. Thank you so much for carving out time, especially 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. your time. Really appreciate it.